Welcome to the Climate Justice Sessions. My name is Sintle Nell, and today we've got an exceptional episode. We're talking to Alia Kajee from the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa. We're talking all things climate finance, why it's important, and why you should know about it, particularly in South Africa. Join us on this episode as we talk about what climate finance is, how it works, and how it compares to other forms of finance, particularly when it comes to climate justice. Hello, Alia.
Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Climate Justice Sessions. We really appreciate you taking the time. I think for the benefit of our listeners and the greater community, please can you tell us a bit about yourself and what the Fair Finance Coalition of South Africa does?
Yes, thanks for having me. It's great to chat in person these days.
Yes.
So my name is Alia. I am a climate finance campaigner with 350.org, which is a climate justice NGO.
Uh-huh.
And the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa is hosted by my organization where I work. But it includes about 7 or 8 other organizations. And together we really work to hold finance accountable to fair climate finance flows, to transparency, to accountability, and really looking at the impacts of finance for climate justice.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one because climate finance has sort of come into the fore, particularly for narratives and sort of as a topical thing. But sometimes it feels a bit abstract. It feels a little theoretical or pie in the sky. But what exactly is climate finance?
So it's a good question because there is no standardized definition. So I think at face value, it sounds quite direct. It's climate finance, financing for climate.
Okay.
But as you said, climate and climate change can be so technical.
Yeah.
So really understanding how finance flows towards climate, is it financing for the climate?
Okay.
Is it financing for climate action? What does it mean? So it's a really good question. So internationally, it is understood as financing or funds that flow towards mitigation activities, so preventing climate change from worsening.
Okay.
Are we preventing climate change from getting worse, from exacerbating, from becoming more detrimental? And that looks like, are we reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the cause of climate change? Or are we adapting to the impacts of climate change? How are we becoming more resilient as societies? And so there are more definitions now included or internationally recognized, like loss and damage, which is another category, which is what are the damages and losses as a result of climate change?
Okay.
And how are these being financed or compensated? But looking at what the definition is really coming down to international agreements that recognize the reality of climate change and how we need funds to address the threats of climate change and the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. But in context, if you look at South Africa, right, so the push is also around adaptation as well as mitigation. What would some of the financial mechanisms be tied to that? And what are the South African examples that we can point to and say, hey, this is an example of climate finance?
So that's a good one because adaptation receives a lot less funding than mitigation.
Sure. Why is that?
So adaptation, if we look at actual financing mechanisms and actual financing flows, it's actually a good example of equity in climate change diplomacy, climate change agreements, because if we look at the international treaty that binds countries that have signed on, we look at the Paris Agreement. So back in 2015, about 125 countries, I think minus the US now, signed on to the Paris Agreement, which is a commitment to acting against climate change or taking action against climate change. And something that is really interesting within this Paris Agreement is that it recognizes the need for developed countries in particular to contribute financing to climate change. Okay. And so I start off with this because it is actually an international recognition to say those who have benefited from resource extraction, from industrialization, do owe more to countries that need to actually adapt to climate change, and we need more resources to address climate change, like South Africa.
Yeah.
And so this is actually a measure of equitable finance flows. So it's recognized in the Paris Agreement as common but differentiated responsibilities. We all have a responsibility to act, but that responsibility is slightly different.
Okay.
South Africa may not have as big of a responsibility as the US or the UK or Europe, but we do need support in taking that action. Now, I start with that because if we look at the causes of climate change, we are much better at defining those causes. It is greenhouse gas emissions from mining,
Methane,
from transport, from industrialized farming. And so it's much easier to measure those gains. So if you stop emitting carbon dioxide, you stop emitting greenhouse gases, you can measure that, and the actions can be installing sulfur dioxide buffers in a coal plant. Now, when it comes to adaptation, it is slightly more difficult, or it's a bit more difficult to measure what it looks like in South Africa, what it looks like in Mpumalanga, what it looks like in Limpopo. How do you measure resilience?
Sure.
How do you measure the impact of adaptation? And so I started from that context because it's very, very important to recognize that there is an agreement to how finance should be flowing. But without a standardized definition, it becomes very difficult to track and measure what exactly are we financing?
Yes.
What is the impact of that?
Yeah.
And so adaptation, unfortunately, has, let's say mitigation in South Africa in particular has about 70% of the climate finance.
Okay. For adaptation specifically?
For mitigation,
okay.
reducing greenhouse gases.
Yep.
Adaptation has less than 11%.
Sure.
And now when we look at how the financing comes, if we go into the mechanisms, I think that might be a later question, but it still follows very, very standard financial instruments, right? So we can use public financing. Yes, financing in the public interest, fairly simple. It could be a grant, it could be a fund, but we are increasingly using more and more private finance, right? So finance that seeks a profit. So if you look at profit incentives, profit motives, there are investors who seek an output, a revenue. And if you look at adaptation, the impact is about resilience, community strengthening, securing livelihoods at a community level.
Yeah.
That may not result in as much profit as something that a mitigation instrument could do. So we could go into the details of that, but fundamentally, adaptation is harder to measure, it's harder to track, it's harder to yield a profit on or a revenue. And so it sees less than 11% of financing in South Africa, yet that's where the impact is needed.
Yeah.
How do we strengthen communities that live near a river, communities at risk of flooding, etc. So
I mean, the difference is pretty stark. I mean, less than 11%. And to your point, it's like, how then do you measure the changes, the impacts and the resilience tied to communities doing that work? But then I wonder, and you spoke about it a little bit, so what are some of the instruments tied to that type of financing? You mentioned loans, but also there's different definitions. They're concessional, non-concessional. So what are some of the instruments available for, specific projects tied to mitigation or adaptation in that sense?
So I started with the international recognition of climate change because under the international institution, which is the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, the UNFCCC,
yes.
which is again a multilateral international body for governing climate change action in a multilateral space. There are institutions or funding mechanisms associated with that. So if we look at the recognition that finance needs to flow from developed to developing countries, there are actually mechanisms within that arrangement. So we've got the Green Climate Fund, we've got the Environmental Facility, there is a Global Adaptation Fund.
Okay.
And so you do have mechanisms through which finance can flow for these specific outcomes. So how these work is the international community or developed countries in particular can put funds or deposit funds, I guess, into these institutions, into these arrangements like the Green Climate Fund.
Okay.
Countries like South Africa can become accredited to these funds. In South Africa, the Development Bank of Southern Africa is an accredited facility. It becomes accredited to these mechanisms,
Okay.
and so becomes eligible to receive finances.
So would that be, So
Yeah.
would that be like a line of credit that's given to the DBSA? Is that,
So
or would it be like a loan that they would apply for?
it works in multiple ways.
Okay.
For these international, so you can receive finances from international sources, from domestic sources, or from very localized sources. You can receive them from public finance, private finance, philanthropic financing.
Yeah.
And so there are many, many, many different ways that finance can flow. So at the international level, you can receive funds through these accredited sources associated with the climate kind of agreements that
Yes.
happen. And these generally work where countries or accredited entities put together a proposal. We can receive funds for very specific projects that we propose funding for.
Okay.
And these proposals get reviewed, assessed, and then funding gets released. However, these become incredibly bureaucratic, very, very complex to receive funding for. The funding releases or the release of funding could take years in some instances. But now, if we look at more local sources, we can see funding coming from philanthropic sources. We can see funding coming from local development funding or local public financing.
Okay.
And these generally flow through public finance institutions like the DBSA, like the Industrial Development Corporation.
Yeah.
And so it can be, as you said, raised as a concessional. So first of all, it could be a market-related loan,
Okay.
right? So you could be borrowing money, not getting money. You could be borrowing money to undertake climate action.
Okay.
You could get a concessional loan, which means you could be borrowing money still, but paying a slightly less than market value interest rate for climate action. You could get a grant, which is where you could see most of the adaptation work happen. For example, you could be receiving money to undertake, let's say, infrastructure builds or strengthening buildings against floods. But this is a piece of a type of financing you wouldn't have to pay back. You see an increasing number of mechanisms or innovations like blended finance. How do we mix public financing, private financing? You could see some instruments now like what we call the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is a mix of blended finance or grant financing or concessional loans and some normal market-related loans in there. So there's a lot of work that comes into exactly what does a financial package look like. Again, it becomes a lot more complicated if there is no standardized definition. So how do you measure it? How do you track it? And how do you actually understand what the impact is going to be? So that is an ever-going piece of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is where I sort of want to get into some of the work that the Fair Finance Coalition does, right? Because if there's no standardized template or criteria per se, how then do communities have that interface with finance? And I think a huge part of the work that you do is actually bringing them into the fore. Perhaps tell us a bit more about the role that, the coalition plays in sort of being that intermediary from a community standpoint, by way of training and some of the projects that you guys are engaged in.
It's a big question because looking at how can communities interface with this. So we work in civil society. So I think it's always useful for us to remember that this is public interest work. So our frame of reference is always, well, what is the impact of this work? Who can access this work? Who can access these funds? What is the impact of these funds? However, climate finance, due to the international financial system, how finance flows normally through commercial banks, public banks, private banks, is a very difficult kind of topic for most people to understand, right? When we talk about how finance flows, sometimes a very valid question is, oh, well, could I go to the ATM? Do I withdraw the funds?
Yeah.
No. Oh, well, can I go to the bank? No, not exactly. Okay, so where is the climate finance? How do you access this? So those are very valid and real questions we get when we organize or when we act or when we work at a community front-facing perspective. If you look at how these funds are flowing, coming from the international community or the domestic kind of financial space, flowing through major institutions like the DBSA or like financial institutions, it is a little bit more complicated. It flows through many different intermediaries, and that follows a very difficult kind of process where you can imagine different pieces or different kind of components of the funds are also taken at different stages of the process, right? What are the service fees? What are the admin fees?
Whatever due diligence needs to be done.
What due diligence needs to be done. Who undertakes the feasibility studies?
Sure.
And that comes at a cost as well.
Yeah.
And so when we started understanding what should the finance be for, South Africa has undertaken a lot of work to actually define all of these. What actually counts as mitigation? What actually counts as adaptation? So it was only in 2022, so about 4 years ago, that we have released the Green Finance Taxonomy by the National Treasury. So what actually counts as green finance? What counts as climate finance? What counts as mitigation? So that does come into force where what actually flows. And back when I used to work in corporate, a big kind of saying that helps us understand some of this is you can't manage what you can't measure. Right. So when we look at how communities access this, you can't just propose or request this financing and get financing for your community, to get financing for your project, to get financing in your municipality. It often flows through major institutions, and you start to understand how difficult it is. Should a community organize as a household, as a community, as a municipality? Do you have an intermediary that kind of applies on your behalf? Oftentimes, it's major institutions or companies that already work in this space, right? Maybe there's an energy company that is applying for financing to kind of invest in more solar power. Those kinds of institutions or businesses or even mining companies kind of have the resources in-house to manage these transactional costs, right? The cost of applying, of putting together a proposal.
Or a team,
Putting together a team, kind of being able to already have an understanding of what your emissions are. So you think of how this financing is flowing in most instances, and you look at a community. Would a household, 2 households, 3 households, a street, would they be able to put together a proposal that is, the same level as the government putting together a proposal for a national kind of waste project that will yield climate benefits? Not exactly. Not exactly. You look at who's been able to utilize climate financing. So if we see communities are not able to access it, well, who is, if finance is flowing? I think between 2022 and 2023, South Africa received about 188 billion rand in climate finance, right?
Sure.
Who's using that if not?
And where is it?
Yeah. Now you start to investigate where this financing is going, and that's the work of the Fair Finance Coalition, who does understand a little bit more of how financial institutions work, particularly finance institutions. So we actually started this work more as how do we kind of understand the role of financial institutions more so than climate finance. That was more of our work. So when climate finance started to flow, we had a bit of a better positioning to ask, wait, how is it flowing? Where is it going? So to kind of touch on that point, where is it going? We start to see the reports, and, we can only really investigate this like 2-3 years later, right?
Yeah.
So looking at even in South Africa, we have major flooding like in the last 6 months. We'll only know in a year or two what financing went to that.
Yeah.
Now you start to understand, like, there's a disaster right now. Nobody can access that money. Where has that money gone? Our research and, research in the space has shown climate finance has gone to things like hotels. Climate finance has gone to consultants.
Sure.
Working in the climate space, climate finance or climate change or mitigation, and not always in South Africa, right? Finance that has been mobilized for South Africa or earmarked for South Africa has been kind of realized or spent overseas with consultants overseas. Some climate finance has even been spent on coal plants, right? So there are coal plants in South Africa that have received international financing for coal plants like Medupi or Kusile.
Yeah.
So now you start to understand the problem with the lack of a definition.
And the complexity, right?
And
because
the complexity.
Who's funding what and why? And how does that then tie into the actual rands and cents that people want to see?
Where we don't actually see it.
Yeah.
So then it becomes a little bit of a different project, right? So the Fair Finance Coalition has been around since about 2022, 2021. And we really had to kind of learn through doing ourselves. And it really was not from the perspective of we are climate finance experts and we want to kind of share this knowledge.
Yeah.
We were more civil society experts, understanding the challenges to realize the public interest.
Sure.
From a rights-based perspective. What does a community do if they, have been going through extreme weather? Or what do communities at the coal face, literally the coal face of coal mining, how do they access not just funds, how do they access their rights? And coming like a little bit backwards or taking a few steps back, how and who funds who funds and how do they fund a coal mine in the first place? What were the environmental checks and balances that actually happened then?
So how did process,
how did that finance flow? Because surely someone checked this out in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, someone did, but that was never made public.
Sure.
So when we started to ask questions as a coalition, we realized, wait. And we had to actually affirm ourselves in a sense to say, if we are asking these questions and we are in this space, how on earth should communities be asking these questions themselves?
Exactly.
And if we had to kind of do all of this research and we are kind of armed with kind of an evidence base of where climate finance is going, should every community member, not just in Limpopo or Mpumalanga, in South Africa, in global South countries, should they all be armed with, the financial technicalities and expertise to be able to engage in this space? Now, that's just kind of ridiculous, in all honesty. Frankly, it's just ridiculous. And so when we started to engage in these spaces, it's not that the two worlds never collided. We were starting to be invited to consultations, right? South Africa does have a good history of public consultation, of putting things out for comment, but not such a good track record in what happens to the consultations. Where does the community feedback go? So when climate finance started to kind of flow a bit more into South Africa, we were saying, if we are asking these questions, how do we support community members to ask the same questions? Because when we asked these questions, we didn't actually get the answers. And it took us a few months, if not a couple of years, to realize this for ourselves, right? Now, when we started to ask these questions from a needs-based perspective, that became a radical reframe to finance. It became a radical reframe because, one, it was valid.
Yeah.
And two, it started to somewhat expose not the uncertainties per se in climate finance, but maybe some of the elements of financing that are not made public. Where's the money going? It's
how
not
much
going
of
to
it has gone to consultants versus communities and projects?
How much has gone to consultants versus projects on the ground?
Yeah.
How much has gone to projects that were listed in 2015, yet financing like the JETPs or the Just Energy Transition Partnerships only started in 2021? So how is a project from 2015 being labeled?
Yeah.
And so we really took it as a coalition. We took it as a learning opportunity where we were able to kind of package these questions as we were learning through these processes and feed them back into community spaces and civil society spaces, media spaces, some labor spaces. And these all came down to questions. And when I say they couldn't be answered, it literally was, well, what is it being spent on? Who is it coming from exactly? Like, who is it actually coming from? Whose interests are being represented? Right? So if it is for South Africa, the JETP finances something like green hydrogen. Was that South Africa's proposal, or did that come from a financer?
Sure.
Now, if we think back to the beginning of just this conversation, is it representing the needs on the ground, or is it representing a profit motive? If countries are loaning us the money, thinking of a normal loan, if someone loans you money, they want to be sure that they're going to get the money back.
Yeah.
And so are those the terms and conditions of the finance flowing, or is it what impact there is on the ground? And so the coalition really just started to put together these resources of, one, what are the questions you can ask of these projects or of this financing? Sometimes it was actually about, well, you can ask these questions, but when? When are you supposed to ask these questions? To who? And at least in the space, we already kind of organize in the space. We are aware of this consultation is happening. We can support communities to attend these consultations. A lot happens in Mpumalanga, so it's about understanding what the financing cycle is for some projects that are going to be happening. When can you still ask these questions? And maybe the last thing I'll say before the next question is we really started to put together some kind of applicable principles to finance, right? Every project is going to look different.
Correct.
But with something like the JETP, I think this is the most kind of publicly known project or financing. I think I said to you in a conversation the other day, I even heard about JETP on like 5FM, right? So you hear about this in the headlines, in the news, you talk about it. And actually just conversing about it in the public, we started to like popularize just some principles, right? Things like equity. South Africa and the global South, as a collective, has really been battered by climate change, but we never actually caused climate change. So does this financing represent like an equitable flow, right? We are suffering from something we never caused. Are we paying for this because we have to pay for the damages? It's happening here in our country. And who's paying for this? Well, we're actually paying the money back in a lot of instances. Okay, it's not equitable. 2, is this financing transparent? What is it being spent on? Well, no, it's not really that transparent. So it doesn't meet that criteria as a principle. Is it accountable? Well, it's not really being spent on what we thought it would be spent on. So who's doing those checks and balances? So bringing these conversations and affirming this in a very kind of public setting really is that radical reframe of where's the money going? And which is a relatable question.
So where's the money going? But also from an equity standpoint, sort of the entire ethos of the climate justice sessions is to say, how then do we embed justice in some of the systems and institutions that are in the work related to climate action and climate change? And I think from the feedback that we've received from listeners, a huge part was also to say, how is then justice sort of tracked alongside these financial loans and financial instruments in real time? And I'm curious to find out from you, how then do you see justice being embedded in some of the financial instruments and levers that we have available from an equity standpoint, but also in ensuring that projects are tied to justice and vice versa? I think when we had our initial conversations, you said something so incredible. You were like, we need to get to a point where finance works for us and not the other way around. And you said, how do we democratize it, right, in real time? So I'm curious about that justice aspect being tied to climate finance.
Yeah. You're reminding me of our conversation now. And I think something that is very difficult to work with, but doesn't mean we shouldn't work with it, is how do we work with complexity and nuance? And I say that because I do firmly believe that defining justice, and again, you can't measure what you can't manage what you can't measure. Defining justice is a very place-based exercise. It's going to look different for me. It's going to look different for you. It's not something I can define for those experiencing the coalface in Mpumalanga. And I think that is something that does make it difficult to track and to measure, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. So I think that our challenge is really that finance flows and kind of, let's just say, projects. Oftentimes our development and our projects or our kind of initiatives in general are measured in market-based terms. How much goes in, how much comes out, how much goes in, how much comes out. But that justice doesn't really fit into that narrative. And so a lot of our work is also still affirming that the justice still is important. Just because you can't measure it doesn't mean we can't converse on it. Doesn't mean we can't still engage
unpack
with it.
And
unpack it and really look at what does it mean and what does it mean for different communities. So I think the challenge does come in really bringing these different topics together. And oftentimes the challenge is, well, how do we continue to pursue this without coming up with a standardized definition as well? I don't mean for climate finance. I do think those definitions are important, but starting to define things like justice. And so our work as a civil society coalition, as an organization, is really about how do we start to at least bring the lived experience into these conversations.
Yeah.
And that's where we started to use the terminology like, it's not about us learning the technicalities of finance, but it's about how can finance learn us?
Correct.
From a human perspective, from a lived experience perspective. How do you start to bring that into the financial conversation because finance is flowing? And how do we make sure it's democratized in the sense that those who are in need of the finance can actually ask questions about it. They can actually hold it accountable.
Yeah.
And all of this practically doesn't look like one project or, one conversation. It looks like regularly engaging with these financial institutions. It looks like attending their annual meetings. It looks like meeting with their ESG, the Environmental Social Governance team, right? And so the Fair Finance Coalition is something that undertakes a policy assessment every 2 years. So assessing the investment policies of the banks. How are you governing the funds that flow through your institution?
Yeah.
It's by the policies. You have a policy for this, you have a policy for that. And so it really looks like embedding certain policies, certain procedures, certain processes, certain topics from our perspective into these institutions through which finance flows.
Yeah.
And it looks like, are the policies working or not? Right, the policies. Does a bank invest in fossil fuels or not? That's a pretty straightforward example. Yes or no. If you do invest in fossil fuels like coal or gas, which is a huge topic at the moment, if you do, when do you plan on stopping?
Yes.
So it's about bringing kind of the scientific evidence base to the finance kind of sector. Are you investing alongside the science or in alignment with what the science is telling us? And then bringing the case studies too. So we've looked at Medupi as a case study. How was this financed? Was it financed alongside the science telling us we should not be starting any new fossil fuel projects anywhere?
Yeah.
Or we will not meet our targets as a planet, as a globe. We will worsen climate change. And bringing examples from the communities in these areas. How have you experienced this mine? How have you kind of experience the meetings with this mine? And so you look at the policies of the World Bank, of the DBSA, even financial climate finance institutions like the Green Climate Fund.
Yes.
They all necessitate consultations. So we actually start to meet with people on the ground, like who've attended World Bank consultations themselves. And, they were told that there will be pollution mitigation or actual pieces of machinery that will be installed in the kind of the pipes of the plant, right?
Sure.
They will actually put buffers into the pipes to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. So we as a coalition actually we go and find out. The World Bank lent this money to Medupi. They said you will get this money if you install the pollution mitigation measures. The community says they have faced horrendous air pollution. I think last week in Joburg, we all got that like foul
sulfur smell,
egg kind of smell. So we go and we have a meeting with Medupi, Kusile. We go and check it out. Well, the pollution mitigation measures were never installed.
Sure.
We go back to the World Bank. You lent this money on this condition. Oh, well, they've already signed the deal, so they don't actually check whether or not it's been installed, but the money's already kind of been processed, right? So it's about bringing together these different pieces from a lived experience perspective and going through these checks and balances to say there were checks and balances stated.
Yeah.
They were never
was it actually implemented?
Implemented.
Yeah.
And the impact has been this at the front face of this challenge, of this community. And so kind of going back through that process, we look at, again, well, there was a revenue stream here, right? There was a revenue stream because there have been investments in Medupi. There's a return on investments. There's still kind of electricity fees being paid. Eskom has to pay back a loan that they've taken. And so if you look at what is accounted for in a balance sheet, that's still an age-old problem of it's not really justice in the balance sheet.
Yeah.
There's no kind of accountability in the balance sheet for, a community facing air pollution. That's still, if you look at the financial terms, it's an externality. And it's still a challenge for how do you internalize these costs into a balance sheet. And really not just a balance sheet, but into operations.
Yeah.
And we look at, more top line or headline conversations lately, like the carbon tax, for example. That's something also trying to internalize the costs of pollution into the operations of polluting entities. So,
Or you even flip it and be like, okay, so Europe has come up with CBAM. Is there an iterative process that we can implement from a South African standpoint? Are we leveraging something that can also counter that? How does that look like in tandem? But I think I appreciate you sharing this resource. It's an activist guide from Fair Financing for Climate Justice. And I think from an empowerment standpoint, we've previously had activists on the podcast.
Yes.
And they showcase some of the work that they've done. And it's interesting to me to say, sort of from a civil society standpoint, you'll play a role in saying, hey, if there are people in the community doing this work, let's capacitate them based on that.
Yeah.
But how then does that catalyze in real time?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And if you go on the Fair Finance website, I'm sure you've seen some of the webinars that they've had, some of the workshops that they've had. But I'm fascinated, is there like a lever tied to M&E? Is there like a following up to say, hey guys, we had this workshop 6 months down the line. What have some of the conversations on the ground been?
Yeah.
Is there a level of awareness in some of the opportunities tied to financing or projects that are coming into the fore?
So it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the work, as you would know, in civil society is really about capacitating people. And so this has been a really long journey because what we started out with now becomes a very unmeasurable component, but stay with me.
Yeah.
It started out with the confidence level of community members, civil society members, media members to actually converse on this topic.
Sure.
And so if we see, we as a coalition began in 2021, 2022, and we started out with just these conversations. And just by starting out with a conversation, we start to collect testimonies from people, right? And it started from the perspective of, I can't talk about that. I don't.
Yeah,
I
I'm
don't
not
know
an
about
economist.
finance.
I'm not an accountant.
I'm not an accountant. I'm not an
Yeah.
economist. I'm not a finance expert, right? And we started in a very similar position, but luckily we had these policy assessments in our back pocket, and we had to build the skill of being able to converse not in the language of finance, but converse in the language of human rights in a financial space. And if you've ever had a conversation with an economist, and now our joke is like some of my friends are economists too, right? But just having that conversation from your own perspective, right? It began in a very difficult place because as civil society people that are not financial experts, you often get told like, you won't understand.
Oh, it's too complex.
It's too complex. So
Can't explain it.
Let me break it down for you. Let me simplify it for you.
Yeah.
It's about the investment cycle. It's about the market-based loans. It's about the interest, interest rate, the repo rate, blah, 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 blah. Like literally it sounds like Greek, right?
Yeah.
If you're
and
not
already
in
that turns
space.
people off because they're like, oh no, what does that mean?
And that turns people off. So when we started to have this conversation, most of our kind of measurement or our M&E was about how do you feel talking about finance? It was largely just measuring people's confidence levels in being able to take a guide like this, and this was long before the guide even came out, just taking this conversation, I mean, at the supper table, in a community meeting at the local school hall or something. How do you feel actually raising this from your standpoint? Because it's not about, as I said, it's not about becoming an expert. It's about raising it from your perspective and not taking that as an answer. Oh, it's too complex for you. And being confident enough to say, you're telling me the finance is for me, but you're telling me my question is too simple. Something there doesn't...
Make it make sense.
Make it make sense.
Yeah.
Literally, make it make sense. And something I say to my husband all the time, just make it make sense. So how do we measure it really started off as how comfortable do you feel talking about this? And we ended up kicking off, but designing, first and foremost, designing something we call the Fair Finance School, where we invite members of civil society, we invite people from the media, we invite people from, all spaces of civil society, and this has happened across the continent as well now. Last year, we even had a youth-based Fair Finance School, so people that were, 18 to 35, which I'm just out of at the moment, as of this year. But kind of empowering or trying to empower different people of different segments of society just to talk about this.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily have you brought down a coal mine, have you brought down a space. Coming from a civil society perspective, it's are you confident enough to kind of engage in this topic? And if you look through the guide, which is also downloadable on the website, it is, are you able to talk to the media about this, right? Oftentimes, if you go to a consultation or you are actually in an affected community where there was just a flood, you might get interviewed by SABC or on a radio station. And it's about, how do you talk to media about this instance? But it becomes about shifting the narrative first and foremost, not directly bringing down a coal plant or challenging a finance kind of mechanism head on. That's still the work that we are trying to kind of conceptualize. But it's about the platforms that you kind of interface with as a member of the community or as a member of the public. Can you talk to media? Can you write an op-ed? Can you pitch an op-ed or an article to a newspaper from your perspective? So are you confident to do that? Can you kind of present or contribute to the platforms you would already have access to? And this guide talks about that. How do you talk to the media about something in a systemic way? I think you asked earlier on in this conversation, how do you address something from a systemic perspective? And for example, it's about going to the media or someone interviewing you, right? Saying, hey, can we chat to you for a second?
Yeah.
It's about saying, well, we are kind of experiencing this as a community. It was never our fault, but they tell us that there's financing for this. Where is it coming from?
Yeah.
Where is it going to? I can't access it. And that slowly chips away at a narrative that, I don't know, the UK or the US is giving us money to, benefit us as Africans or South Africans to kind of battle climate change. So from a civil society perspective, how does change happen? How do we shift a narrative? How do we shift the media? How do we shift kind of these actors one at a time?
Yeah.
How do we challenge the social license for some of these mechanisms, not just, coal plants or fossil fuels, but also some of the finance mechanisms as well. So it's really about chipping away at some of these interfaces or these platforms we already have access to and being very firm and resolute from your perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly it, right? Empowering them from their perspective, but also making it context specific, because to your point, there is a sort of realization from a community standpoint of saying, hello, we have these resources available. How do we capacitate ourselves to speak truth to power?
Yes.
But also that accountability aspect that says, okay, we've got industry surrounding our homes.
Yeah.
What does this actually look like for us in real terms?
Yes.
Be it from a regulatory standpoint, legislation. And I love that awareness, because that's where change takes place, to your point. Like, it's systemic changes that take place. And I think the role that the coalition plays is brilliant, because a huge part of it is to say, I'm not going to wait. Let me go online, download the guide, and actually learn for my benefit and get curious, right? To be like, what does this term mean? What doesn't it mean?
Yeah.
And I think you guys play that role brilliantly. So shout out to the coalition.
Thank you.
But I think, Alia, this work is also deeply personal. It's difficult.
Right.
And you face a myriad of different stakeholders, and sometimes it's costing.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to then know from your personal perspective, why do you do the work that you do?
Yes, I saw this question in the. It's very difficult to answer, because it's to me it becomes quite simple, right?
Sure.
Like, I think if I can phrase it from an everyday perspective, it's almost like I couldn't imagine doing something in a different way. But I think you hit the nail on the head with curiosity. I think that's for me where it started. So if I just, not to make it about me, but if I just even go through like my professional journey in trying to answer these questions, I think it's the best example of how anybody could follow not a similar path, but ask the same questions in their own journey, not as in a professional sense, but in a just a daily experience sense. So I've always studied my favorite subject at high school was geography. Like that, just where I started. I was like, I live here. Let me be curious.
Let me get curious about the country.
Get a bit curious.
Yeah.
And so I studied climate change, but from a very curious, I won't say naive, from a curious perspective, I started working in the corporate sector, and I think I was with a bunch of other curious people as well to say, well, coming out of university, I was like, oh, well, let me just study the science of this. And if I work in corporate, I'll just tell the kind of corporate clients out there, like, hey, this is what you're doing.
Yeah.
Don't you want to change?
Do better.
I'm a little bit slow sometimes. So it took me about 3 years to realize, like, they don't want to. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
You knew this all along?
Sure.
Wait, something's not adding up. So from a kind of corporate perspective, I was met with, corporate clients. Again, I was in the corporate sector, so they were my clients, not necessarily like stakeholders in a climate conversation, but they should have been. But answering the question from a South African perspective then, okay, wait, it's not just about the science. We are getting feedback like it's about development. Okay, how do we develop and how do we also mitigate our emissions, right? So from a science perspective, South Africa is a major emitter in the continent as well. And that goes back to our legacy during apartheid too. So that's a whole other podcast maybe.
Yep.
But I do believe we are a developing country or middle income country now, but we also do have a responsibility to the rest of the continent and our own kind of citizens or our own kind of population to mitigate our own emissions. So then I was like, but how do we answer that question? How do we develop and mitigate? And then I moved away from science and I did development studies. And then I got into the civil society space when I returned from my studies. And I actually worked with mining affected communities. Now, the literal kind of coal face in the front lines of those who are affected daily by mining. And it's a very different picture. And, that really taught me about reframing. So I literally interviewed mining companies from a corporate perspective about their climate change plans and actions. And just by virtue of this kind of journey, I worked with mining affected communities and interviewed them about their experience of the very same mine sometimes, and compared these answers. So what people say they're doing versus what is actually happening.
Yeah.
And the curiosity to find that out became a very big motivating force for me. This is happening, but that's happening, but someone is really getting the kind of short end of the stick here. And how do we bring that to the forefront? And then I wouldn't say it's like a driving force for me, but then using these kinds of stories and trends and looking back in my own kind of experience, right? My grandparents grew up in Merebank, which is where there was an engine refinery. I remember being like a kid and literally like shooting BB guns like across the road to the engine refinery from like my grandparents' house. And then as studying climate science, I'm like, should the house have been across the road from a refinery? I don't think this is pretty harmful. Yeah. And then learning about all of the people in that area who ended up with cancer, right? My own grandparents included. Not growing up now as an adult, getting married, like going to my grandparents' in-law's house in Rivoli, where they are re-digging and re-exploring for gold and reprocessing kind of old mining waste for gold, and that has highly insane levels of uranium. And I'm like, wait, this is still going on, right? Like, so from my own kind of life journey, but who's doing something? And that is a very, very relatable question for anybody. Who's doing something about this? And so just becoming curious about, wait a minute, what do I see around me? what is happening about this, and being lucky enough to be employed in a space where, in all honesty, I can get my livelihood and pay my bills with work.
From the curiosity too.
From this curiosity. So, I think you hit the nail on the head. It really comes from a curiosity and literally that feeling of like something's not making sense here. Let me just try and make sense of it. And it becomes like a lifelong journey.
Yeah. And what a beautiful journey, because I hope you also see the synergies of you being young Alia with the BB gun and you now, because I think sometimes we realize that so much of our childhood obviously plays an impact to who we become. But if there's that synergy and that golden thread that ties you to the work that you do, it's also beautiful to see. And so thank you so much, Alia, for joining us on the Climate Justice Sessions, but also sharing so frankly about the importance of the work that you do and how we all have an inherent responsibility, right? In one, knowing the spaces and environments that we operate in, but also who's funding what.
Follow the money.
Follow the money and make it make sense. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Any parting shots, any last remarks?
If it is about finance, I will try and end with our catchphrase.
Yes.
With finance is not neutral. I think a lot of us kind of maybe ask these questions or kind of take it at face value, like finance funds this, finance goes there. But if you really look at the impact of finance, it can either make or break an initiative, right? If it goes to the wrong thing, more of the wrong thing happens.
Yeah.
If it goes to the right thing can happen. And so asking these questions about finance and actually understanding that it's not a neutral tool, someone somewhere could be pulling the shots or pulling the strings. It's about being curious about those strings and what's happening. So it is about taking some responsibility. Not all of us are able to, but about being curious about where's the money going? And wait. It's not this neutral, unquestionable, technical thing. It's very, very, very political. And we often say it's really about kind of this feminist way of organizing where, just asking these questions, really challenging or asking truth to power. So who has the power? Who doesn't have the power? And again, bridging that gap of what's going on in between.
Yeah. Finance is not neutral. I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alia.
Thank you
really
for having
appreciate
me.
it.
Thanks.
Should we do a high fiver?
I want to knock this again. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on the Climate Justice Sessions. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Also share your suggestions on who you'd like to have on the show or any other topics that you think we should explore. This is us from the Climate Justice Sessions.